Alright, so I'm going to be recording and reading chapter 6 from book 3. It starts on 273, and it's called Triumph. So, just as a little bit of background, catching you up, from the end of chapter 5, we found out that Charles Darnay's trial is going to be tomorrow, so where we're picking up that in that chapter 6. And then at the very end, the last lines and the last paragraph in chapter 5 leaves off this kind of like cryptic message about someone who had shown up in Paris who was not there before. So think about like who hadn't been there yet and who might be showing up at this time. Also, so this chapter is going to go over Charles Darnay's trial. So this is his second trial. We saw his first one before where Sidney Carton saved the day, and Lucy's passion for him. And now we're going to see the second one. So I just want you to think about the last trial we saw for Charles Darnay and any similarities, differences, things like that as we read. The dread tribunal of 5 judges, public prosecutor, and determined jury sat every day. Their lists went forth every evening and were read out by the jailers of the various prisons to their prisoners. The standard jailer joke was, "Come out and listen to the evening paper, you inside there." Charles Evrémonde called Darnay. So at last began the evening paper at La Force. When a name was called, its owner stepped apart into a spot reserved for those who were announced as being thus fatally recorded. Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, had reason to know the usage. He had seen hundreds pass away so. Okay, so this is like a really brutal way of running these prisons. I'm skipping over onto page 274. It's the first full paragraph. It starts with, "The passage to the conciergerie was short and dark. The night in its vermin-haunted cells was long and cold. Next day, 15 prisoners were put to the bar before Charles Darnay's name was called. All the 15 were condemned, and the trials of the whole occupied an hour and a half." So if you think about that, obviously, can these trials be fair? That's over the course of 90 minutes. They conducted and sentenced to death 15 different people. So if you do that math there, it's about 6 minutes each trial, which is crazy, obviously. So keep going. It says, "Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, was at length arraigned. His judges sat upon the bench in feathered hats, but the rough red cap and tricolored cockade was the headdress otherwise prevailing. Looking at the jury and the turbulent audience, he might have thought that the usual order of things was reversed, and that the felons were trying the honest men. The lowest, cruelest, and worst populace of a city, never without its quality of low, cruel, and bad, were the directing spirits of the scene. Noisily commenting, applauding, disapproving, anticipating, and precipitating the result without a check. Of the men, the greater part were armed in various ways. Of the women, some wore knives, some daggers, some ate and drank as they looked on, many knitted. Among these last was one with a spare piece of knitting under her arm as she worked. She was in a front row by the side of a man whom she had never seen since his arrival at the barrier, but whom he directly remembered as Defarge. He noticed that she once or twice whispered in his ear, and that she seemed to be his wife. But what he most noticed in the 2 figures was, that although they were posted as close to himself as they could be, they never looked towards him. They seemed to be waiting for something with a dogged determination, and they looked at the jury, but at nothing else. Under the president sat Dr. Manette in his usual quiet dress, as well as the prisoner could see. He and Mr. Lorry were the only men there, unconnected with the tribunal, who wore their usual clothes and had not assumed the coarse garb of the Carmagnole." Okay, so there's 2 people who are not on the side of France necessarily, and this is Mr. Lorry and Dr. Manette. Other than that, things that we should notice are that the Defarges are like front row center for this. They are here to watch what happens and to make sure that Charles Darnay gets sentenced to death for this. So first paragraph of 275. "Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, was accused by the public prosecutor as an emigrant whose life was forfeit to the Republic, under the decree which banished all emigrants on pain of death. It was nothing the decree bore date since his return to France. There he was, and there was the decree. He had been taken in France, and his head was demanded. "Take off his head," cried the audience, "an enemy to the Republic." The president rang his bell to silence those cries, and asked the prisoner whether it was not true that he had lived many years in England. Undoubtedly it was. So again, this is all in, it doesn't have quotation marks, but this is all back and forth dialogue. Was he not an emigrant then? What did he call himself? Not an emigrant, he hoped, within the sense and spirit of the law. Why not? The president desired to know. Because he had voluntarily relinquished a title that was distasteful to him, and a station that was distasteful to him, and had left his country, he submitted before the word emigrant to the present acceptation by the tribunal was in use, to live by his own industry in England rather than on the industry of the overladen people of France. What proof had he of this? He handed in the names of 2 witnesses, Theophile Gabelle and Alexander Manette. But he had married in England, the president reminded him. True, but not an English woman. A citizeness of France? Yes, by birth. Her name and family? Lucy Manette, only daughter of Dr. Manette, the good physician who sits there. This answer had a happy effect upon the audience. Cries in exultation of the well-known good physician rent the hall. So capriciously were the people moved that tears immediately rolled down the several ferocious countenances which had been glaring at the prisoner a moment before, as if with an impatience to pluck him out into the streets and kill him. So on these faces of people who had just looked at him like as if they're gonna take him out and kill him, now are in tears because he is related and using Dr. Manette as a witness. So the first paragraph of 276, it says, on these few steps of his dangerous way, Charles Darnay had set his foot according to Dr. Manette's reiterated instructions. The same cautious counsel directed every step that lay before him, and had prepared every inch of his road. The president asked, why had he returned to France when he did and not sooner? He had not returned sooner, he replied, simply because he had no means of living in France, save those he had resigned, whereas in England he lived it by giving instruction in the French language and literature. He had returned when he did on the pressing and written entreaty of a French citizen who represented that his life was endangered by his absence. He had come back to save a citizen's life and to bear his testimony at whatever personal hazard to the truth. Was that criminal in the eyes of the Republic? The populace cried enthusiastically, no, and the president rang his bell to quiet them, which it did not, for they continued to cry no until they left off of their own will. The president required the name of that citizen. The accused explained that the citizen was his first witness. He also referred with confidence to the citizen's letter, which had been taken from him at the barrier, but which he did not doubt would be found among the papers then before the president. The doctor had taken care that it should be there, had assured him that it would be there, and at this stage of the proceedings it was produced and read. Citizen Gabelle was called to confirm it, and did so. Citizen Gabelle hinted, with infinite delicacy and politeness, that in the pressure of business imposed on the tribunal by the multitudes of enemies of the Republic with which it had to deal, he had been slightly overlooked in his prison of the Abbaye. In fact, he had rather passed out of the tribunal's patriotic remembrance until 3 days ago, when he had been summoned before it, and had been set at liberty on the juries declaring themselves satisfied that the accusation against him was answered, as to himself by the surrender of the citizen Evermond called Darnay. So essentially, Dr. Manette has prepared and like has prepped this entire case. So he made sure that the letter was there, he has made sure that he was there, and that these people know who he is. He's obviously trying for one way than the other. So last line of 276, it says Dr. Manette was next questioned. His high personal popularity and the clearness of his answers made a great impression, but as he proceeded, as he showed that the accused was his first friend on the release of his long imprisonment, that the accused had remained in England, always faithful and devoted to his daughter, and himself in their exile, that so far from being in favor with the aristocratic government there, he had actually been tried for his life by it, as the foe of England and friend of the United States, as he brought these circumstances into view with a great discretion, and with the straightforward force of truth and earnestness. The jury and the populace became one. At last, when he appealed by name to Monsieur Lorry, an English gentleman then and there present, who, like himself, had been a witness on that English trial and could corroborate his account of it, the jury declared that they had heard enough and that they were ready with their votes if the president were content to receive them. At every vote, the jurymen voted aloud and individually. The populace set up a shout of applause. All the voices were in the prisoner's favor, and the president declared him free. Okay, so 2 trials, and Charles Darnay both times has been acquitted. This is obviously rare. It's rare to happen once, let alone twice. But this time it's obviously due to Dr. Manette's facilitating this entire case for him. Okay, so midway down 277, it says, then began one of those extraordinary scenes with which the populace sometimes gratified their fickleness, or their better impulses toward generosity and mercy, or which they regarded as some set off against their swollen account of cruel rage. No man can decide now to which of these motives such extraordinary scenes were referable. It is probable to the blending of all the three, with the second predominating. No sooner was the acquittal pronounced than tears were shed as freely as blood at another time, and such fraternal embraces were bestowed upon the prisoner by as many of both sexes as could rush at him, after his long and unwholesome confinement he was in danger of fainting from exhaustion. None the less he knew very well that the very same people, carried by another current, would have rushed at him with the same intensity to rend him to pieces and strew him over the streets. Again, so think about mob mentality. This went one way because of one thing, and it could have gone the other totally, just as easily. So last paragraph, 277, says his removal to make way for other accursed prisoners who were to be tried rescued him from these caresses for the moment. 5 were to be tried together next as enemies of the Republic, for as much as they had not assisted it by word or deed. So quick was the tribunal to compensate itself and the nation for a chance lost that these 5 came to him before he left the place, condemned to die within 24 hours. The first of them told him so, with the customary prison sign of death, a raised finger, and they added in the words, "Long live the Republic." Okay, so these 5 guys come in, and before Charles Darnay even makes it out of this courthouse, these 5 are condemned to death altogether. So again, his trial is different. The 5 had, it is true, no audience to lengthen their proceedings, for when he and the Dr. Manette emerged from the gate there was a great crowd about it, in which there seemed to be every face he had seen in court, except 2, for which he looked in vain. Obviously the Defarges. On his coming out, the concourse made at him anew, weeping, embracing, and shouting, all by turns and all together, until the very tide of the river on the bank, of which the mad scene was acted, seemed to run mad like people on the shore. So every single person who was in the courtroom is rushing out with him, is like hugging him, and he feels like he's going to pass out. But every single person loves Darnay. They're all excited, and that had a hand in the other 5 being condemned to death so quickly, because there was no one there to sway the judge in one way or another with their emotion. Okay, so second paragraph down, 278. It says, they put him into a great chair they had among them, or which they had taken either out of the court itself, or one of the rooms or passages. Over the chair they had thrown a red flag, and to the back of it they had bound a pike with a red cap on its top. In this car of triumph, not even the doctor's entreaties could prevent his being carried to his home on men's shoulders, with a confused sea of red caps heaving about him, and casting up to sight from a stormy deep such wrecks of faces, that he more than once misdoubted his mind being in confusion, and that he was in the tumbrel on his way to the guillotine. In wild dreamlike procession, embracing whom they met and pointing him out, they carried him on, reddening the snowy streets with the prevailing Republican color, in winding and tramping through them, as they had reddened them below the snow with a deeper dye. They carried him thus into the courtyard of the building where he lived. Her father had gone on before to prepare her, and when her husband stood upon his feet, she dropped insensible in his arms. Like classic Lucy, she passes out when he gets there. As he held her to his heart and turned her beautiful head between his face and the brawling crowd, so that his tears and her lips might come together unseen, a few of the people fell to dancing. Instantly all the rest fell to dancing, and the courtyard overflowed with the Carmagnole, which is that dance that we saw in the chapter before. Then they elevated into the vacant chair a young woman from the crowd to be carried as the goddess of liberty, and then swelling and overflowing out into the adjacent streets and along the river's bank, and over the bridge, the Carmagnole absorbed them every one and whirled them away. After grasping the doctor's hand as he stood victorious and proud before him, after grasping the hand of Mr. Lorry, who came panting and breathless from his struggle against the waterspout of the Carmagnole, after kissing little Lucy, who was lifted up to clasp her arms around his neck, and after embracing the ever-zealous and faithful Pross who lifted her, he took his wife in his arms and carried her up to their rooms. Lucy, my own, I am safe. Oh, dearest Charles, let me thank God for this on my knees as I have prayed to him. They all reverently bowed their heads and hearts. When she was again in his arms, he said to her, "And now speak to your father, dearest. No other man in all this France could have done what he has done for me." So pay attention to this. This is important. The last little bit here. She had laid her head upon her father's breast as she had lain his poor head on her own breast long, long ago. He was happy in the return that he had made her. He was recompensed for his suffering. He was proud of his strength. "You must not be weak, my darling," he remonstrated. "Don't tremble so. I have saved him." Okay, so this is the end of chapter 6. Obviously, this is so good. The reason it's triumph is that Charles Darnay gets out. And really what's so important here at the end, too, is that Dr. Manette now feels fulfilled. He feels like he is recalled to life in the fullest sense of the word, and that finally all of this time that he spent in jail is kind of made worth it by the fact that he was able to like give back to Lucy by saving Charles Darnay. So he feels like he has purpose, and that he has fulfilled his purpose, and that all of this was worth it because he was able to pay Lucy back in this way. Okay, next is chapter 7.